Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. After a long break to talk about other things and to travel, and because of the holidays, we're ready to get back into Exodus. I'm picking up today in Exodus chapter 7, the first 2 verses, and then jumping down to verses 6 and 7. I'll read first from my own translation from the Hebrew. Yahweh said to Moses, "See, I have appointed you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet. You shall speak everything I command you, and Aaron your brother will speak to Pharaoh, that he must send the Israelites out of his land." And skipping down to verse 6, Moses and Aaron did just as Yahweh commanded them, so they did. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. All right, so at the end of last year, I worked my way very slowly through the genealogy in chapter 6 and showed how genealogies are interesting and how the genealogy was the answer to the question that Moses raises, or the objection that he raises about not being qualified to go to speak to Pharaoh because of his speech impediment. And God gives this genealogy in part to isolate Aaron as an authorized representative of Moses, somebody with delegated authority who can speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. So we're picking up now at the other end of that chiasm as the narration gets ramped up again. Now, the way that this is stated is a little bit odd. God says, "See, I have appointed you as God to Pharaoh." What does this mean? Why would God call Moses a god? There's only one God, right? Here, God is using an analogy to explain the roles of Aaron and Moses relative to God and Pharaoh. So normally the way things work is that God sends a prophet who can announce his word to the king. That is how it normally works all through the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In this case, the appointed prophet has a speech impediment, and so the prophet needs a prophet. So that elevates Moses, it like moves him up the ladder. So now we have Yahweh who's going to speak to Moses, who will then turn and speak to Aaron, who will then go to Pharaoh and deliver it. So we have an extra step in the delivery of God's message to Pharaoh. So this passage expresses the heart of prophetic vocation. A prophet doesn't speak on their own authority. They pass along the message that God gives them. And here, Aaron is going to be raised up to pass along the message Moses gives him, which makes him a little bit like God, except that Moses is also getting his message from God. So we just basically have a longer chain. The ages here are remarkable. We're told that Moses is 80 and Aaron is 83 as they head back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. Now, we learn from the end of Deuteronomy 34, verse 7, that Moses was 120 when he died. And we know that the people spent 40 years in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, and that he's 80 years old here. The years in between there are a bit fuzzy. How many years did Moses live in Egypt before he fled and went to Midian? Well, rabbinic tradition puts it at 40, so that he spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, and then 40 in the wilderness of Midian, and then he goes back to Egypt, brings the people out, and spends 40 years with them in the wilderness. So there's a dividing of Moses' life neatly into 3 parts. We get a glimpse of this in Acts chapter 7 when Stephen is reciting Israel's history in his sermon right before he's stoned to death. And he says that Moses lived 40 years in Egypt and then 40 in Midian before returning to deliver the Israelites. We're not sure how he knows this or how he got this information. He might have simply deduced it from the standard practice of thinking of generations as 40 years, given that Moses left and then when he returned, that Pharaoh had died. He might have just been estimating using basic math, or maybe he's aware of this rabbinic tradition. Maybe they capture something that wasn't written down in the book of Exodus. But the mention of the ages of Moses and Aaron is significant because it signals that at this moment of time, they have finally come to their moment of heroism, that this is the purpose for which they were born. We see examples of this in Genesis 17:25 and 41:46, where it mentions the age of someone who's stepping into their ultimate purpose on earth. So that signals to us that we're about to see what Moses and Aaron were born to do. Since Aaron is 3 years older than Moses, that indicates that Pharaoh's edict to throw Hebrew boys into the Nile likely happened between their births. So Aaron escaped that initial purging of Hebrew baby boys. He was already born and had already survived infancy before it happened. Tradition tells us that Miriam was the firstborn, and so we could estimate her to be about 3 years older than Aaron, which makes her about 6 years old when Moses is born, and makes sense of her being old enough to stand and keep watch by the edge of the Nile, waiting to see who will discover her little brother. So many questions that we still have. So many questions that I still have about the ages of Moses and Aaron and how all of this works out, like when Moses and Aaron go back. If he's already 80 years old when he returns, then think of this scene where Zipporah circumcises their son on the way back to Egypt. Does that mean their son is already 60? Or let's see, if Moses was 40 when he left Egypt, that would mean that his son could be anywhere like as old as 40 himself or 39, depending on how quickly Moses got married to Zipporah and how quickly they started having children. There's so many questions we can't answer, and in part it's because the narration has been compressed. We have a lengthy story about Moses' birth and a lengthy story about his return to Egypt, but all the intervening years, aside from his encounter with God at Sinai, are squished into a few verses. So there are many questions that we'll have to wait till the new creation to find out the answers to. I hope you've enjoyed this, and when we come back next week, we'll talk about Pharaoh's hard heart. Have a great week.